Welcome to this deep dive. We're tackling a really fascinating historical question today, using a classic text to explore, well, what actually makes someone a hero?
Yeah, we're digging into some excerpts from Thomas Carlyle, specifically his ideas on great men and, how this concept of heroism pops up across different times and through different kinds of people.
Right, and we've got a whole range of his examples from ancient god figures right up to modern writers. So, our mission today,
We want to get past the surface stuff, find the core of what Carlyle thought heroism was.
and see how it changes, maybe, and why it still matters to us. We're looking for those surprising connections you might miss otherwise.
Okay, so let's start with his big idea. Carlyle sees heroism as this really basic thing, almost a divine relation, he calls it. It's like a connection between these great men and everyone else, stretching through time.
Not just about actions, then. More like a feeling.
Exactly. It's that feeling of admiration, looking up to someone you see as somehow higher or greater. He says it's a really vital influence in life.
A divine relation. That sounds pretty deep. And he connects it straight to a person's religion, doesn't he? But not just church attendance, right?
Yeah, not at all. It's their basic outlook on the mystery of life. He actually says that's the most important thing about a person.
Wow. Okay.
And he contrasts different ways people have, faced that mystery. You've got heathenism focused on the physical world, lots of gods, power coming from physical force, essentially.
Okay.
And then there's Christianism, which he sees as shifting focus to the invisible, the spiritual, as the true reality. Time is seen inside eternity, and power shifts from, well, force to holiness.
And where does skepticism fit in all of this? Is that a religion, too, in his view?
For Carlyle, yeah, but
Mm.
it's the religion of denial. It's denying that unseen world, refusing to even acknowledge a fundamental mystery. He sees it as a major limitation.
So it's way bigger than just formal religion. It's about how you fundamentally see reality. And he
Yeah.
says something pretty interesting about old beliefs, like paganism, doesn't he? He doesn't just dismiss them.
No, absolutely not. He really insists that even beliefs that look, well, strange to us now, they must have had some kind of truth in them when they started.
Otherwise,
Otherwise, why would people have lived by them for centuries? He argues they weren't just scams or, dupery at the beginning. There was something real they were responding to.
that's quite a generous way to look at history. It forces you to search for the underlying human element.
And he says understanding those beliefs helps us understand ourselves. Different sides of our common human nature, he calls it. The real truth, he suggests, isn't just in one view, but maybe in the sum of all these different perspectives on life's mystery.
Okay, so the heroes he picks embody these different ways of seeing. Let's get into the first one, the hero as divinity. Who's the key figure there?
That would be Odin, the central figure in Scandinavian paganism. Carlyle looks at how those Norse people experienced nature
How so?
with this sense of wonder, seeing powerful forces, storms, fire, frost as divine gods, or sometimes as demonic giants, the Jotuns.
Right, like Luke for fire, Thrym for frost, Aegir for the sea tempest.
Exactly. And he throws in this amazing little detail, the word eager, apparently derived from Aegir, the sea giant.
No way.
He says bargemen on the River Trent in England still use it to describe a dangerous tidal wave, a bore.
That's incredible. A word from a myth surviving in working slang today shows how deep those beliefs ran.
It really does. And he speculates that Odin himself might have been a real historical figure, a hero whose way of thinking basically shaped a whole culture.
And the core truth in that paganism.
It was recognizing the divine in nature itself. He kind of compares it to how we might see something incredibly beautiful today and call it poetic. For them, that power, that beauty was divine, seeing the sacred all around you.
Okay. And what was the absolute heart of that Norse belief system, the main value?
Valor, courage, simple as that. The idea that the brave go to Valhalla with the Valkyrs and the cowards end up in Hela.
That's stark.
It is. And he thinks that valor was first forged against the sheer harshness of nature, the cold, the storms, and that same toughness, he argues, carries on in their descendants, in us even.
From fighting frost giants to, well, whatever challenges we face, puts a different spin on resilience. Okay, then he shifts gears to the hero as prophet. Mahomet is his example here.
Right. And he really pushes back against the common view of Mahomet as just, a calculating schemer,
How does he see him, then?
as this deeply earnest, confused voice coming from somewhere deep and unknown. A man driven by an inner reality he couldn't ignore, not by, political ambition.
And the core of his message, Islam, submission to God.
Yes, but Carlyle frames it as the only true morality. It's about accepting and obeying the fundamental law of how things are. The reality of the world is ordered by God. Not questioning, but submitting to that just law.
That's a strong interpretation. And what about Mahomet the man? What does Carlyle highlight?
His sincerity, above all. Living alone, wrestling with his soul, and the sheer reality of existence. Seeing the universe not as ordinary, but as an awful fact and reality. Constantly miraculous.
He mentioned small details, right?
Yeah, like mending his own shoes. His basic honesty, the incredible respect even the wild Arab tribes have for him. Things that suggest real authenticity.
Mending his own shoes.
Yeah.
It makes him feel grounded, human. What about the Quran?
Again, sincerity is key. Carlyle says that's its main merit. He notes it can be repetitive, maybe a bit rough in structure, incondite, he says, but argues it's full of flashes of real thinker and seer.
Like glimpses of genius.
Exactly. Someone with a true eye for the world, showing rude vestiges of poetic genius. He pulls out quotes like, "You have compassion on one another, law might have made you having no compassion," as examples of this direct, powerful insight born from sincerity.
So the earnestness makes even an imperfect text powerful.
Yeah.
And the ideas of heaven and hell in Islam.
Carlyle sees them not as literal descriptions, but as sort of rude shadows, pointing to a much bigger, grand spiritual fact, the infinite nature of duty.
Mm-hmm.
The point wasn't the specifics, but Muhammad's absolute deadly earnest belief in it.
And he argues Islam's success came from that truth.
Yes, not from falsehood, but from the core of truth within Muhammad's utterly sincere message. That's Carlyle's take.
This theme of sincerity, it really is the bedrock of his whole argument, isn't it?
It absolutely is. He
Yeah.
makes it totally explicit. Sincerity is the saving merit, the fundamental virtue. He calls it the first and last merit in anything meaningful. It's the root of all other genuine qualities.
So what's the flip side, the opposite of this vital sincerity?
That would be formalism. Idolatry, but not just statues. Worshipping a symbol after it's become empty when the truth it stood for is gone. Semblance, living in appearances, in a vain show. It leads to what he calls spiritual paralysis. He's very clear. False men, living in semblance, they can't build anything that lasts.
Whereas the great man, the hero, they just can't live like that.
Exactly. They cannot help being sincere. They live right in the awful presence of this reality, the hard facts of existence. While others might drift on the surface, the hero is anchored in the deep truth, however difficult it is.
You know, that contrast feels incredibly relevant now, thinking about how much of our lives, our culture, maybe operates on formulas and hearsays, or just pure semblance instead of, well, genuine contact with reality.
It really makes you question what we value, doesn't it? Authenticity versus appearance in any era, but maybe especially today.
So let's move to the later forms. He talks about the poet. How does the hero as poet connect to the prophet?
He sees them both as vates, that's a word meaning seer or inspired thinker. Both are fundamentally sincere.
But different.
The difference is where they connect with that mystery of life. The prophet connects on the moral side, duty, God's law. The poet connects on the aesthetic side, the beautiful. Though, Carlyle adds, these often merge. True beauty includes goodness.
So both see deeply, just through different lenses, and poetry itself, how does he view that?
He sees it basically as song. An inarticulate, unfathomable speech, he calls it, connecting us to the infinite, to things beyond words. He even suggests everyday speech has a kind of song or tune in it, reflecting feeling.
That's a lovely idea about language. Who's his main example of the hero as poet?
Dante is the big one. Carlyle points to his hard life in exile, come duro calle, how hard the path is, an intense, almost gloomy personality. The contrast with the court jesters.
Right, and the Divine Comedy itself.
He sees it as this necessary outpouring from Dante's soul, this mystic, unfathomable song he had to express. And again, sincerity is crucial. Dante didn't just invent hell, purgatory, paradise. He saw them as a visible fact.
He believed it utterly, and its impact.
Carlyle calls it the most enduring thing our Europe has yet made, and the reason it lasts. It comes from the inmost parts of a man's soul. He does contrast its impact with Mahomet's, though.
Oh, so?
Mahomet reached the masses. Dante, he says, speaks more to the noble, the pure and great. He's like a pure star, a treasure for the chosen few.
A different kind of influence. Okay, and the other giant poet hero? Shakespeare.
Shakespeare. The greatest of intellects, Carlyle says. But, and this is key, he was unconscious of his own genius.
Unconscious? How does that work?
His plays aren't seen as carefully constructed things, but as products of nature. They just grew organically. His greatness bubbles up from the inarticulate deeps inside him. Carlyle compares him to a force of nature, a wild Arab lion.
So not deliberate craft, but something flowing through him.
Kind of, yes. His gift is the seeing eye, perceiving and showing the inner reality, the harmony of things. That's why his work keeps offering new meanings centuries later. Carlyle makes that incredible statement.
But what about the Indian Empire?
Yeah. Indian Empire or no Indian Empire, we cannot do without Shakespeare. Basically saying his value is beyond politics, beyond empire.
Wow, that really elevates art.
He sees Shakespeare's work as feeding the very life roots of all excellent human things. Absolutely fundamental.
Okay, from poets who tap into timeless truths, he then turns to a very modern figure, the man of letters.
Right, the hero emerging with widespread writing and printing. And Carlyle makes a huge claim here that these writers are the real working effective church of a modern nation, the Fourth Estate.
Printing equals democracy, he says.
Essentially, yes. Spreading ideas, giving voice to the people. It's the power of the written word made accessible.
But he also sees a big challenge for these modern writer heroes.
Definitely. They're often working in what he sees as chaos, particularly in skeptical ages. He points to the 18th century as an example of spiritual paralysis.
An age of semblance.
Exactly. An era where appearance, semblance, was valued over reality, and deep sincerity was often doubted or even mocked. He mentions Benthamism, utilitarianism, as the peak of this, seeing the world like a steam engine. Heroism, but with its eyes put out, blind to deeper truths.
That sounds pretty bleak. An age valuing calculation over soul.
It does.
Yeah.
But interestingly, the text offers a glimmer of hope here. Carlyle seems to believe the world is shifting, starting to become sincere again, and will eventually be heroic once more.
Back to that idea that semblance can't last. Reality has to break through eventually. Okay, what about heroes in direct action? He talks about the priest and the king.
The priest is the spiritual guide, connecting people to the unseen holy. And Carlyle notes that the best priests are often the best reformers too, because they genuinely believe in divine truth. They're seers, not just functionaries.
And the king, the practical leader.
The king, or conning, the original word meaning able man, is the leader in the practical world. Their main job is order, making the chaotic regular.
The ideal is finding the most capable person.
Yes, the ablest man, who must also be the truest-hearted, the most just, and then loyal obedience to that person's guidance. Both ruling well and obeying well are framed as aligning with God's law, the natural order of things.
So ability and morality have to go together for the ideal leader. But what if the leaders or the systems become corrupt, become mere semblance?
Well, that's when revolution and reform become necessary. When the institutions, the formulas, are empty shells, totally disconnected from reality, they must be thrown off. Carlyle sees it as incredibly difficult, often chaotic, but unavoidable.
Like Protestantism or the French Revolution.
Exactly. He views them as violent, messy, but ultimately necessary reactions against entrenched semblance, a forceful return to reality.
And who's his prime example of a hero leading through that kind of turmoil?
Cromwell.
Cromwell, yes. He's presented as a mix of prophet and king. The inarticulate prophet, Carlyle calls him, driven by deep conviction he couldn't fully express, who rose from being a farmer to the acknowledged strongest man in England.
And his fight was for
reality and fact, specifically for establishing the law of God's gospel in the real world, in England's governance.
What about the controversial stuff, like dismissing Parliament? How does Carlyle handle that? He presents it from Cromwell's viewpoint, as something done out of sheer necessity. When Parliament just produced talk, endless debate with no action on urgent, real practical facts, Cromwell felt he had to act.
So, not planned ambition, but responding to the situation.
Yes, Carlyle suggests these actions were like births of providence, forced by the reality of the moment, not calculated moves.
That's a very different lens on political power.
Yeah.
What about Cromwell the person, his character?
He's described using really strong, earthy words, savage depth, wild sincerity, clear, determinate man's energy, and crucially, Carlyle emphasizes his lack of ordinary ambition, like, keep your fancy titles and wealth, just let me deal with what's real.
Grounded in bigger things.
Totally, grounded in death, judgment, and eternity. He's portrayed as this solid rock, a fixed pillar amidst all the chaos and uncertainty.
And like the prophets and poets, may be hard for a later, more skeptical age to really grasp.
Exactly. Carlyle points out how difficult it is for an age of elegant euphemisms, an age prone to cynicism, to understand a man like Cromwell. They might just dismiss him as a hypocrite, missing the depth of his struggle and sincerity.
And his ultimate goal, according to Carlyle.
To make the right God's law as he saw it win out in England. to actually create the theocracy, the government of God, that reformers like John Knox had only theorized about. Cromwell's actions are seen as the peak of Protestantism in practice.
So despite history's mixed judgment,
Carlyle argues he achieved enormous things we benefit from today. We walk smoothly over his great, rough, heroic life, perhaps without fully appreciating the reality he grappled with.
it really is a powerful thread running through the whole thing, isn't it? This intense connection to reality, the sincerity. From Odin in nature to Mahomet hearing God's law, Dante seeing visions, Shakespeare reflecting reality, writers spreading truth, Cromwell fighting for divine order.
Yeah, it's the constant, the essential quality. And the counterpoint is always that when things become empty, just forms, just semblance, they eventually break down. Reality, often through these sincere, maybe difficult figures, pushes back.
Which really brings us full circle and leaves us with a pretty pointed question, prompted by this whole deep dive. Carlyle says that when semblance collapses, sincerity of some sort has to begin, and that the world ultimately has to obey him who thinks and sees.
Right, so if you take that seriously,
What kind of heroes, what kind of sincerity does our world need now, navigating our own complexities, our own potential semblances?
and maybe more personally for you listening,
Mm,
how can we as individuals try to connect more genuinely with that awful fact and reality in our own lives instead of just living in formulas or appearances?
definitely something to chew on.
Yeah, a lot to think about there.